and Park Lane, Kolkata. So may I invite our Honorable President of the Academy, Professor Somnath Das Gupta, and our speaker, Dr. Sandip Chatterjee, onto the dais. This is the time to formally welcome the speaker. So may I request our President to welcome you formally and introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. A good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this customary pre-AGM annual oration of the West Bengal Academy of Science and Technology. We traditionally invite very eminent people to talk on this occasion, and today we have a very distinguished speaker amongst us, and I have the honor and privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sandip Chatterjee, very distinguished neurosurgeon in our city and well-known neurosurgeon all over the world. And he, of course, needs no introduction. Nevertheless, out of his very long curriculum vitae, I will highlight some of the points, the major points in his career. So, Dr. Sandip Chatterjee received his MBBS degree in 1984 with honors in surgery and ophthalmology, followed by FSCS from Edinburgh in 1989 and FSCS neurosurgery in 1994. I can see a long list of societies of which he is a member from all over the world. So I will not attempt to name any one of them, but say that he is a member of many important societies all over the world. He has also written considerable number of papers, scientific papers, actually more than 138. He has in international journals. He is in the editorial board of 6 journals, authors of 22 book chapters, and co-author of 3 books. So in addition to his professional career, he has contributed to science quite a lot. He has been the visiting professor of AIMS, Delhi 2019, University of Birmingham, Alabama in 2019, University of Lyon, France in 2018 and 19, University of Cape Town, South Africa 2017. Today he has kindly given his consent to talk on a very contemporary topic, lessons learned and unlearned during the COVID pandemic. Now, as we all are quite unfortunately familiar with the pandemic, so this will be definitely a momentous occasion for all of us to listen to a very thoughtful talk by Dr. Sandip Chatterjee. So may I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Chatterjee to this meeting and invite him to deliver his talk. Dr. Chatterjee, please.
Namaskar. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to come to this august gathering. I have been told that this is an annual event of the West Bengal Academy of Science and Technology, where men of scientific importance talk to men and women of scientific importance about scientifically important subjects. And I have to begin with an apology that I do not fit into this criteria at all. Asking a professor of brain surgery to talk about intricacies of science is a bit like asking your hairdresser in the saloon to talk about the brain. He has geographical proximity to the subject you want him to talk about, but unfortunately the problem is not only a depth of knowledge, but also a problem of knowledge of depth. And I hope you will forgive me if I ask you for the next 30 minutes or so to listen to what is essentially a very personal, philosophical rather than scientific experience of the COVID pandemic. When I speak around the world and I show neurosurgeons this photograph and I ask them what they see, all of them, like all of you in this audience, say they see a man and woman in embrace. But when I show this photograph to middle school children, and I go to schools to talk about how to prevent head injuries, and show the same photograph and ask them what they see, do you know what the answer? The answer, they see 6 dolphins. And if you can go back to your school brain and look at this photograph, you will see 6 dolphins as well. Because the human brain is an amazing organ that we understand so little about, even though we touch it 3 times a day. And the brain likes patterns. It likes conformation to patterns. And those of us with our adult lives and existence look at this and see men and women in embrace. Those pure school boys and girls that see this see dolphins. And I tell you this because what I'm going to talk about, the pandemic, is going to be a bit like this photograph. It's the way I interpret the pandemic, and it may not be in conformity with anybody else. And it is not the expression of the feelings of any scientific, social, or political group as much as it is a personal philosophy. And I will ask you over the next 30 minutes, therefore, to laugh with me, cry with me, but bear with me. And I thought I would entitle my talk, Lessons Learned and Unlearned During the Pandemic. I have been a professor for 15 years, and as I go around teaching around the world, because I chair the education committee now of the World Society of Pediatric Neurosurgery, which is one of my specialty interests, I always say lessons and learning has a very special connotation for me. I tell my postdoctorate students the first day they join that learning begins by answering questions. That's what you've done so far. But for learning to progress, you have to learn to question answers. And for learning to really reach its pinnacle, you have to learn to question the questions themselves. And a lot of which I'm going to tell you over the next 30 minutes is going to be questioning answers and questioning questions as well. And I start off with that day in 2019 when the Earth was blissfully rotating round the sun, and we were all going about our duties as men of science. We were traveling to different universities, giving lectures, flying aeroplanes, making gaping holes in the ozone layer around this Earth, increasing the temperature of this planet, destroying nature, the way we human beings have been doing for a very long time. And this prompted this fantastic article to come out in 2019 in the American Scientist, and look at the words, ending the crisis of complacency. In science, there can be no greater crisis than complacency. And complacency and the crisis of complacency, as the author writes in this beautiful article, ends in one of two ways. Either the scientist learns that he's complacent for the wrong reason and he doesn't understand what he's complacent about, or there happens a phenomenon which puts the scientist into place and makes him realize he didn't actually understand anything. But the words are so amazing, they rang in my ears as I talk to you even today. The crisis of complacency in science, and something that we have to at all stages be aware of. Because then descended on this planet this brainless blob of RNA, christened by the human race as the COVID-19 virus. And a small little brainless blob of RNA that brought the entire Homo sapiens species down to its knees. What it did was something that the greatest dictator, the greatest conqueror, the greatest religious teacher, the greatest social activist never achieved in centuries of human existence on this planet. It united the whole world. And the whole world and the whole species of the human race was united not by any other factor, but by the factor of fear. Fear, ladies and gentlemen, is what united us for the first time as a race around this planet. And this little piece of RNA should get credit for that. When I look back and look at the lessons we have learned, perhaps we are still learning, I would like to divide this into three parts. Lessons we have learned as human beings, as members of the Homo sapiens species on this planet. Lessons we have learned as men of science, and men and women of science fill this auditorium. And also lessons we have learned as men of medicine, which I can tell you were the harshest lessons of this entire pandemic. As human beings, I think we learned the 3 H's. We learned humility, we learned humanness, and we learned horrors. And I'm going to elaborate on each of these. Humility is something that we learned as we realized that what Dr. Darwin had told us wasn't entirely the truth. And as I always say, the Darwin fairy tales only told us that we as a species was top of the ladder, but top of the ego ladder, not top of the eco ladder. And if you really look at the ecological world, as human beings, we are there with the snake and the reptile. We are not there, as we like to imagine, in the world of ego. After all, it is the brain that tells us that our brain is the best organ and therefore we are superior. But when you yourself judge yourself and say, I am the best, it is never right, as we know from analogy with our politicians itself. So we had people all over the world, like politicians like this, writing essays immediately saying that coronavirus is a global crisis, not a crisis of globalization, lest we feel we have to reduce our forays into the rest of the world. But what was the most important humility that this pandemic taught us? It taught us of the difference between our needs and our necessities. It taught us to do more with less. It taught us that you do not need to go to the shopping mall. You do not need to make that trip by business class to an overseas university to give your lecture. You do not have to travel every alternate weekend abandoning your work to be an examiner in a university elsewhere in the country. You do not have to go to multiplexes to watch films with your partner on an evening or go to the restaurant for a meal with your children. He taught us that we can stay at home and still be happy. We can still enjoy a meal at home. We can still take examinations. We can still give lectures around the world, sitting in the comfort of our chairs. And in fact, some of us who were endowed with the responsibility of taking educative lectures around the world ended up with a new experience. For the first time ever in my life, I had the experience of giving lectures wearing a jacket and a tie with a pair of shorts underneath, because that was not visible to the camera of the laptop. We learned to be happy with so much less. And as you may not have been told, I'm actually a professional photographer, and neurosurgery is my hobby. And we learned, and these are photographs I took during the pandemic, we learned to look at nature with a different light and to be happy looking at a simple combination of water and light. That's all this is. And look at how marvelous nature reveals itself. Or a combination of water and light, like this photograph I took on New Year's Day this year. Sunrise on Mount Kanchenjunga. Thinking and make you feel that there is still life ahead of us with hope. This is the humility that made me write my first article about the pandemic. Not published in a scientific journal, but published in a popular magazine. And I called it "The Dog Days Are Here." And the article, as you can see on the screen, says, Knight, my Labrador, who I actually lost during the pandemic, writes, and I'm going to read out a little bit of it because it's a mockery of us as a human race. Remember, this is being written by my dog. Something wonderful is happening into this world, and I am convinced about it. Do you know that for the first time in my 10 years on this earth, my master, who is a busy doctor, is returning home by 5 p.m.? Like most other human beings I know, this poor man has gone crazy. He now leaves home late, returns early, sits for hours at a computer desk, sits with the family after dinner, and enjoys films on television, and even walks in the garden, something he did once a month before. He no longer leaves home once every 3 weeks, allegedly to teach in some obscure part of the planet, and no longer are suitcases that smell of strange lands wheeled in from the car on his return. I go on to quote another little part of that article. Humans have been afflicted with a strange disease. They're all hiding in their homes, from what I do not know. And when I see these poor creatures emerging from their homes, they have their mouths covered in the same sort of muzzle they put on me every time the vet gives me an injection. Except they're not being injected, but their faces reveal a fear of something worse than a needle prick on their bottoms. They seem to complain every now and then of death and devastation in the world, which to me appears a lot more serene and pleasant than it was before. Sans noise, sans pollution, sans smoke, and sans cars. And in fact, this is the sort of humility that we learned as a race. The second age we learned as a race was humanness. And I think above all we realized that the greatness of humanity is not in being human, but being humane. We learned to be humane to our own family members that we taken for granted as we left for work in the morning and returned in the evening or 5 days later. We learned to think about our neighbors who had been afflicted with COVID, that elderly couple next door who had nobody to go to their house to cook for them. We learned to get some food and leave it at their doorstep with some water and with a note saying, leave these utensils out when you've finished your meal. Never thought of doing that before. And as the Dalai Lama writes, love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. And the only reason why we have survived so far is because of love and compassion that were exhibited during the pandemic. And the third edge that we were subject to, I told you about humility and humaneness, was of course the horrors of the pandemic. As we recall the front page of the Time magazine, or we recall those horrific scenes, all of us, each and every one in this room, knows somebody who was in that situation. And we really do not want an action replay to last much longer than this. What did we learn as men of science? I think if we learn the 3 H's as members of the Homo sapiens species, we learned the 3 D's as men of science. We learned science must have direction. We learned about digitalization, and we learned about devastation. What did we learn about direction? My favorite quote of direction, which I tell all the researchers that I am involved with, is from Alice in Wonderland. Where Alice comes to a fork in the road, there is a fork going right and a fork going left, and she says, which road do I take? And the Cheshire cat in Alice in Wonderland, who's sitting on that road, says, where do you want to go? I don't know, Alice answered. Then, said the cat, it doesn't matter. And I think science was at a crossroad. When we realized, what do we do research on? Do we do research on checking how silicon affects the human brain and causes Alzheimer's disease? Or do we do research on how the impact of having the COVID-19 virus in your blood causes your blood to alter, the capillaries of your brain to become narrower, and the blood supply to different parts of your brain to be affected? And there was a time, few months ago, when 1 out of every 2 stroke patients admitted to our hospital was COVID positive. And the stroke was a manifestation of COVID. Do we do research on that? Or do we do research on Alzheimer's because it pays more? Do we spend more money on cardiac diseases, on brain diseases, or do we spend more money on trying to conquer the different viruses that might infest the planet? And in fact, the next thing we learned was digitalization. I'm told even the gods became digitally sensitive, so that when patients to be protected from COVID said, oh God, please save me, the gods replied as JPG or PDF. And of course, they weren't saved in life in many occasions, but digitalization became a new era. It became the new level ground on which all of us, some of us who were not exposed to the extent of digitalization, the younger people of this audience, who are of course born, evolved much more, as Dr. Darwin told us many years ago, were able to cope. We were not. We realized soon all over the world that Zoom was not a sound made by aeroplanes taking off, but had a different connotation in the world of the pandemic. And we all became digitally sensitive of the news and requirements. Home delivery, which to us as medical students meant this, changed to this. And of course, had another new meaning in our lives as we could get everything delivered at home, from a test kit for COVID-19 to any item of food, clothing, or anything else that you required. In fact, those of us that were entrusted to run educational courses around the world spent 7 months in devastation because there was not a course. I used to run 14 courses around this world from China to Chile, and I ran 14 in 2017, 18, and 19. In fact, 15 in 19. We could run none in 2020. And of course, we were devastated. our international society had lots of funds which we couldn't utilize, and nobody was willing to travel to give lectures in a different part of the planet. So all of us evolved different methods of teaching, different methods of getting our youngsters to learn while they were in the solitary confinement of their homes. And this is what I started as chairman of the Education Committee of the International Society of Pediatric Neurosurgery. We called it the Clash of the Titans, and we got two very famous colleagues of mine from two different universities around the world to talk on a controversial subject for 30 minutes each, and then had the audience ask them questions for 30 minutes. But every single month, twice a month, every alternate Friday of the month, we organized a digital event like this. And this, I am happy to tell you, has become so popular that now, although we've resumed physical courses, people still want this Clash of the Titans to continue, not with the same sort of motive that students in this city want virtual meetings to continue. The second D, after digitalization, that we have learned is devastation. And the role of science, technology, and innovation has been not only now to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 on research, the impact of COVID-19 on innovation, but to support responses, research responses, and innovation responses to COVID-19, which we never had before. People who make masks have become millionaires, and unfortunately for some wrong medical advice, people that make sanitizers or make sanitizers seem to have become billionaires. But it is also equally important to understand that we've been now able to do lots of scientific innovations which in future will protect you and I from any deadly virus. And if you really look at this article, which looks at the impact on scientists' work, you will see how the use of research material and facilities have decreased in the last 2 years, how funding for research has decreased, and how amazingly scientists have commented in this article that time available for research seems to have decreased as well. The third, something that I really find difficulty to understand. And finally, what have we learned as men of medicine? I hate to tell you this, but what I'm going to tell you might shock you or even horrify you. But the three things we learned was about our ignorance, our incompetence, and our irrelevance as a profession. And I'm going to tell you why. We learned about our ignorance. I don't know about you, but this is an ICMR, the Indian Council of Medical Research guideline, which suggests that everybody exposed or possibly exposed to the coronavirus should have hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis. And all of us were gulping down this tablet, which is actually a medicine used for rheumatoid arthritis and other arthritic diseases, every Sunday morning. We were supposed to take 7 initially, and then the National Task Force for COVID-19 recommended that you should continue to take it if you were a medical professional and you were in contact with a possible patient, which of course all of us were. So all of us continue to take these tablets, all of which have horrible effects on your heart rate, on your heart's ability to pump, and in fact on your blood pressure and circulation. We now know it was completely useless, and that hydroxychloroquine does nothing at all to prevent COVID. We were also ignorant as a professional group and advising the public that they should not touch anything that has come from outside. So we were recommending that people should not touch the newspaper that the newspaper man had delivered, and they should read yesterday's newspaper tomorrow. I knew families who had vegetables delivered at their doorstep. Until they ripened 72 hours later, they didn't take them inside their house. But we now know neither the ripening vegetables nor do newspapers delivered by a harmless newspaper boy have the ability to transmit COVID-19 virus. The virus is much smarter than that and doesn't rely on newspaper men and vegetable vendors to inflict people of the human race. But we were ignorant. And all the advice we gave all of you as a professional group, most of it was wrong. And I think as a member of the medical professional group, I think I owe you all an apology for our ignorance. We ourselves, dressed like this is not a fancy dress party. This is what we wore during surgery. We wore this protective equipment, which wasn't sterile. So on top of that, you had to wear a sterile gown. And God forbid, if you were a brain surgeon that needed to operate on a brain for 6 to 7 hours, wearing this, 2 masks, 2 gloves, 2 stockings, and this gown, at the end of the 7 hours, even if your patient didn't need admission to intensive care, the surgeons often did. And really, we needed to go out, take a shower. Actually, for the first time ever in my life, I had to go into my office, have some cold water, rest before I could come back to do a second surgery. And most of us were incapable of doing more than 1 surgery a day. But the incidence of brain tumors or brain problems do not reduce during a pandemic. So you see, we were the victim of our own ignorance as well. The second I that we were subject to is incompetence. And we realized how incompetent we were as a professional group, or indeed how incompetent we were as a nation, when we could send a rocket to Mars and have satellites orbiting the Earth. We didn't have enough oxygen for our own citizens. And this horrendous article that came out in New York Times about the night the oxygen ran out in Delhi bears testimony to the fact that we just didn't care that we didn't have enough oxygen for our citizens, even though we spend so much of money doing so many other things in science. It is just fortunate and totally coincidental that a lot of oxygen plants are located in this state, and hence this state was possibly much less affected. But we have states in the south and even in the north that don't make oxygen, have people turned away for lack of oxygen. In the hospital where I work, the government repeatedly told us that's a specialized hospital, we have pediatric, we have neurosurgery, you don't need to make it a COVID hospital. But we forced the Department of Health to sanction us to become a COVID hospital because we had our own patients that we'd been seeing for 15, 20, 25 years, dying on the road because they couldn't get a bed to get admitted into the COVID hospital where they could get oxygen. Those nights of nightmares I can recall when I got telephone calls at 1:30 a.m. from patients of mine saying, my son is 38 years old. I am sitting with him in the car park of your hospital. His saturation is 70, I have 1 cylinder, it's running out. They tell me there are no beds in your hospital. Can you please do something? I have just found out there has been a death. Can my son be put next to that dead body on the same bed so that he can get the oxygen? And those are nightmares you really don't want to listen to about. But that's what we've been through. And that's what we've been subject to because of lack of oxygen. An ex-director of health service, a lady in this state, whose son is one of the leading cardiologists in California, was unable to get his mother, and he's a classmate of mine, and I struggled all night on the telephone and could not get his mother into a hospital which had oxygen. And she succumbed the next day for lack of oxygen. But above all, in addition to our ignorance, in addition to our incompetence, the worst realization we had was our irrelevance. Science has no value if you cannot teach your political masters to accept what is scientifically correct. You can do all your research with your mouse and your molecules in your laboratories, get all the prizes that scientific communities can offer you, but it cannot impact your citizens' lives unless you can convince those in power to enact methods which ensure that what you're doing in the lab becomes reality in practice. And those of you that hate big institutions of science and technology, believe me, it is a waste of time trying to do experiments which advance our world as a whole, unless you can convince your and my political masters to understand their need to enforce it. And never before in the history of the medical profession in this country, and indeed in this world, if you saw the United States, you will understand how frustrated the medical community was that the president did not seem to understand what a first-year medical student would not understand to pass and get into second year. The same thing, we saw this in this country. Believe it or not, the greatest frustration was this, and this is a quote from the Hindustan Times, lest you think I'm giving a politically motivated statement here. But this is what it said. We had elections during the second wave, and the whole medical community, the Indian Medical Association, every single medical association told the government this was no time to have an election. We were going to kill thousands more than the virus would by a human decision. And if you look at the same article, it tells you across the political board, all our political parties responded with the same amounts of disdain to what the medical profession had to offer. Everybody rejected every single scientific judgment. Talking about scientific judgment, both our honorable government at the center and our esteemed government at the state had advisory groups, the so-called medical advisory groups, advising them as to how to combat the COVID-19 virus. And I'm going to share with you two major facts about this. And this is not to make you disheartened, it is to make you understand where we are as a nation and a state. This country, if you look at the top 10 virologists in the world, 7 of them come from India. And do you know how many virologists were there to advise our central government in the panel, and how many virologists were there to advise the state government in the panel? 0. Not a single virologist. And yet we have the best in the world. A friend of mine, who's a professor of chest medicine in PG Hospital, made a remark. My classmate, who's an economist, from Presidency College, who also happens to have won a Nobel Prize in economics, is being consulted by our government as how to reduce chest problems during this pandemic. And I'm a professor of chest medicine who's never been asked anything about it. And the same was replicated by our government at the center. The same was replicated by the government in the United Kingdom. Same by the president in the United States. So what was the relevance of us as a professional group? We were ignored completely when it became political necessity to ignore what medical advice was given. And of course you know that doctors who are invited by politicians, be it in North America or in Calcutta, to give medical advice to people in power, are doctors who would have no way of finding their way up to the top of the profession without being completely subservient to their political masters and telling them what they want to hear rather than what they should be hearing. It was the time for me to write my second commentary on COVID-19. And this has been published in the International Journal of Neuro-Oncology, nothing to do with neuro-oncology at all. But they published it because they wanted a specific issue devoted to COVID-19 and neurosciences. And although I did write a neurosciences article, which I'm not sharing with you on the same, in the same issue, I'm going to share with you this commentary that was also published. It's a poem, and I'm going to crave your indulgence to read out the first and last paragraph of this poem I wrote, which is one of the few times I have ever delved in poetry in my life. This is the first paragraph. And it was written the night a friend, a classmate of mine, lost his mother in our hospital due to COVID-19. It was also written the night a patient of mine that I had operated on his spine 15 years ago, who was now 37 years old, walked into the hospital coughing and spluttering with an oxygen saturation of 75% and said, "Can I have a bed with oxygen?" And then went on to add, "I don't want my parents to know, they're too elderly. If they find out, they will die of a heart attack. I cannot let them know, so I've just come alone." And we said, in keeping with our principles, that's possible, we can admit you, but we have to let somebody know. It's great persuasion that I had to make. I had to go to the COVID ward, hold his hand and convince him to give us his wife's phone number. We called his wife and informed her, this 37-year-old, that was the last time I saw him. The next time I saw him, he was rolled in a black cloth, in a black bag, being carried away by corporation people to an ambulance, without his family having ever a chance to see him again. And this was the poem I wrote on that poignant night. When the night sky flashed its warning knell, she looked at you in pride as well. And one last time you saw the face of the lady you called mother. And then that first smile you ever saw became all still, as is the law, and you knew the virus had claimed another victim. Yet you could not cry, because there were still other lives to try and save, those that trusted you, who needed your help in distress, because you were still a doctor. And the last two paragraphs. And because you caused no noise and never spoke in one clear voice, they even made you work for free to push their success story. Alas, what use is knowledge thus, when those in power make all the fuss and leave you aflame and uncared for within the man-made inferno? They listened not what you had said, they trampled on what you had read, they left you mixed the dying and dead, for you were just a doctor. They that did drag you to court and painted your misdeeds to note, and shamed you well to hide their blame, and slandered well your name, now felt you had to save the grass, and alone douse the fire. And yes, your mother's face did beam in pride at her son's dream, at those final moments which daunt at our imaginations. But how many mothers may in future pray, and in their dreams but say, "Thank God he's not a doctor." I told you you have to laugh and cry with me. But this is what we've been through during the pandemic. But there is still hope. There is still a lot that we have learned. And as I looked at this seagull flying on the rainbow, I thought, nature has possibly forgiven us for this last time. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to end with the words of Rabindranath Tagore. And Rabindranath wrote, "If you cry because the sun has gone out of your life, your tears will prevent you from seeing the stars." We still need to see the stars. You, ladies and gentlemen, are men of science. We cannot be embittered by this experience. You have to be enriched, empowered, enlightened, and emboldened by this experience. I wish you well for the future, and thank you very much.
Dr. Chatterjee, this was really wonderful and mesmerizing. Now, he has kindly agreed to entertain a few queries from the audience. So if you have some queries, please.
Yes, sir, nice. Thank you very much for a nice talk. So I gone through about the affair of giving 2-DG, 2-deoxyglucose for treatment of cancer, and government also estimated the price ₹999 per sachet. As a cancer scientist, I know that it is a poison, it is cardiotoxic. We try to make some upload about the matter, but failed. Government went on giving this known poison to the patients. What's your opinion?
This is not within my sphere or ambit of scientific knowledge, but as a principle, it is a reflection of exactly what I've told you about. That, we spend our lifetime in laboratories and research, in science, trying to prove something is right or wrong. But ultimately, the decision of whether to enforce it or not doesn't lie with the scientific community. And that's really the problem that has occurred in cancer research more than anywhere else, because there is so much money for cancer. There is so much money if you say you want to do research into a heart disease. You say you want to put up a bed for a heart disease, you will immediately get money. But if you say you want to take a bed for brain surgery, you will get no money. And I always say the reason is that people with fat wallets have thin arteries in their heart, but people with thin wallets have thin arteries in their brain. That's really the problem.
Yeah, please.
I'm Udayan Dev. You have given a very good observations, the benefits that COVID-19 has offered us, like not the necessary to travel to other countries for talks. But one thing is, we have become dependent very heavily, time-wise and otherwise, on internet and computers. Even children, babies, even children, school children and everybody are depending on internet, computers, sitting in front of it for large part of the day. It's very harmful, everybody knows. This electromagnetic wave does a lot of harm to the brain, and I don't know why scientists as well as medical people are mostly silent about it. Why the corporations are expanding it. We are going to 5G, which is, as you all know, much more harmful. What is your comment, sir, on this? Please.
Well, you see, without naming any company, this instrument I'm carrying in my pocket, and all of you have in your pocket, if you ever go to the net and find out how much radiation this gives you, you will find there are 3 or 4 phones all of you are using. If you hold it close to your ear, which is within 5 centimeters from the temporal lobe of your brain, and if you hold it for more than 50 minutes every 24 hours, you subject your temporal lobe to irradiation, which is harmful and possibly a source of having tumors in the brain, including cancer. Just for your information, the incidence of brain tumors worldwide has been increasing ever since we discovered the mobile telephones. And in fact, there is an irony in all this. I don't know whether you know the story, but again, I don't want to name any gentleman, but a famous man who was responsible for the iPhone was informed by a scientific group, and this answers your question why we're not doing anything, by a scientific group, that are you aware that this iPhone number so-and-so has so much of radiation, which is just a fraction or less than what is harmful for the human brain. And Mr. Steve Jobs, I'll tell you, mention his name, Steve Jobs replied one line to that email. He said, here at Apple, we're not interested in cancer. It is a sad testimony to his reaction that 6 months later he died of cancer himself. But this is exactly how multinationals view these things. What is profitable is worthwhile, just like what is politically useful is worthwhile, and what is scientifically correct has no value. Because you and I sitting in this auditorium may say, this is not science, but the man outside this auditorium who is selling tea on the stall outside this institute doesn't give a damn about what you think as a scientist or what I say as a doctor.
Hard facts.
So this will be the last one, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your excellent talk. Now my query was that you have mentioned about medicals we should have learned and should we will not unlearn. Particularly regarding the medicines, now we know that some of the medicines prescribed initially, in the initial phase, that were proved to be unnecessary. Of course, now we have learned medicines, so it is a process which is obviously doctors cannot say everything is not possible. My point is that this kind of overprescription of drugs, these are particularly a problem in India or it is worldwide phenomenon. So that was my.
Again, I practice medicine in only 3 countries, which is Canada, the United Kingdom, and India. So I cannot talk about the other countries. I have to talk about these 3. I think the practice is more or less the same, except that, of course, you know the problem in this country is that you can prescribe a medicine by its name, not by its generic name. So you're allowed to prescribe the name of a pharmaceutical company's medicine. Whereas in the United Kingdom, you are not allowed to do so. You have to write a generic name, so the chemical name. In Canada and North America, unfortunately, it's the same as in India. So it depends on the perspective of life which you look at. But you know about COVID, it's really the story of a drowning man who will clutch at any straw. Not that that straw helps him to stay afloat, but that it is normal human nature to clutch at anything when you're drowning. And therefore anything that came, and 2-hydroxychloroquine came. ICMR did some work which was done on rodents, and they felt that this works. We are a little bit removed from rodents, and therefore everything that works in rodents doesn't work nicely in human beings. But so they said, use it, because there was nothing else. Nothing else was available. Nobody knew what happened. We still don't know what are the long-term effects of COVID-19. We still have people just falling down dead with heart conditions who had COVID 6-7 months ago, and nobody knows why. So none of us have the experience of what happens because of COVID. So it was just clutching at straws. You can't really blame anybody for clutching at straws, because you want to just try anything that works. We now know it didn't work. It did more harm than good. Just like, you know, we used to douse ourselves in sanitizers, cover our hands, feet, everything in sanitizer. Absolutely useless. If you just protect your nose and mouth, that's enough. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the queries, and let us once again congratulate Dr. Chatterjee for a really fascinating talk, because he has provided all of us lots of food for thought. And I must say personally, I have not listened such a fascinating talk in my life. This was fantastic. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to present a small memento to Dr. Chatterjee. Thank you very much. No.
So,